Hello and welcome to another episode of Q&AI. This is an episode I've been excited and waiting for the last couple of months. Today we have Nancy Wang joining us from One Password. She has got a tremendous experience of training large language models, so I look forward to this episode. Nancy, welcome. Maybe we can start with a little background on Nancy Wang.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me, Bob. Well, as you mentioned, I'm from One Password. I'm currently the CTO at One Password, where I drive our AI product strategy, our AI security products, along with engineering, infrastructure, data, and so we can get into all of that today during our conversation. So essentially, the very top of the stack, where customers can see our application, play with our essentially thick clients, all the way down to how do we make sure that our data stays secure, that our clients or our customers' safe credentials stay secure when they're stored at One Password. And so we can go into that encryption model, how we build into our zero knowledge architecture. But before we go into all that, certainly have also had the pleasure of working at, as we talked about, both big companies like Google, AWS, but also smaller companies. Although now, they're been very fortunate to also have seen them go public, like Rubrik, for example, where I was early PM. But essentially, I would say what sums up my career track is I've always been really interested in learning how systems work. And especially now, and we can cover this as well, is as these systems evolve into autonomous systems, right? They can reason on their own, is how do you train them to do their best, right? Perform against preset objectives when, for example, the path to those objectives isn't entirely clear.
Yeah, so I'm totally with you. I mean, I've been on the mission for the self-driving network piece of it, so I share your vision. But what I'm excited about today is Google, AWS. It sounds like you've been in the trenches with these large language models to help train them. And I've always wanted to know, is like, why can only the big guys train these large language models? Is there ever a day when the average person can train these things?
I would say certainly, and this is where I think, especially in this day and age, right? It is so fun to be a builder. In fact, if we take a step back, right, and just look at all of the tools at our disposal, there are, for example, companies like Base 10, Fireworks, right, Modal, where you can do your own post training of models, right? Essentially, take a pre-built model, but essentially then train it on your own data to then therefore adjust some of the weights, right, associated with that model. One of actually the new concepts that we're super excited at One Password to start trialing is this idea of reinforcement learning. So let me take an example. Right, there's a company out there called Mercor that has really been at the forefront, especially in the last 18 months. Right, they were one of the fastest growers from 0 to 150 million in AR. Now they're much, much more than that. Right, and they've been really helping these frontier lab companies like Meta, OpenAI, and many others essentially do data labeling. And why is that important? Because when you're looking at specialized models, so take, for example, a model that serves physicians in healthcare, or models that are being asked to make very, very nuanced decisions in the legal market. Well, a lot of that data isn't public. Right, you're not able to actually get that knowledge by simply scraping the web, right, or by crawling existing databases. It's very nuanced information and needs to be annotated by experts. So now let's take that into the collaboration that we're doing with Mercor here at One Password. Well, we're excited to actually build a fully functional DevOps agent together. And why reinforcement learning, which is one of the, I would say, concepts that Mercor is pioneering here, is important is because supervised fine tuning, right? What I just described with training with your own proprietary data sets can perhaps answer 80% of the question. But the remaining 20%, or that last mile problem, is really, well, how does this agent or how does this model behave when the environmental factors are uncertain, right? So take an example in the DevOps space, right? Debugging a database, making sure that your systems are healthy, making sure that your uptime, right, is 4, 5, 6 nines. Well, the recipe for that, algorithm isn't always clear. And so that's why, and we can go into more nitty gritties here around the reward functions, right? So the reward functions really has to be tied to system output or system desired behavior.
Okay. Now we say training. I mean, I think there's like people think of training like Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT. There's also this fine tuning concept where we're training. So are you talking about trying to train some layers of a big, large language model or trying to train a model from scratch for finance or specific use case?
Sure. So this would be certainly involved in the post-training process. Training and essentially building the layers of the model. There are many more folks who are way more qualified than myself to do that work, right? What I'm talking about is taking an existing model and essentially
Like
adapting that.
ChatGPT or Claude? Yeah.
Sure, or open source models and many of them as well. In fact, I was just on a panel with one of the GMs from Minimax, right? They just launched a new model as well, and they're very deep in voice, multimodal, but essentially taking a model that exists out there. And I would say the best layman's term is adapting that for your use case, right? So in our case, it is making sure that our users are not, for example, putting credentials into fraudulent websites, right? That they're not getting phished and having to give up their credentials. Also, in the case of the reinforcement learning example that we just talked about with Mercor, it's about building a DevOps agent that can autonomously actually tell itself, hey, when I'm seeing these alerts in Datadog, right, when these alarms are firing, this is what I have to do next, right? There is no pre-built runbook, right? There's no pre-built data sets, right? It has to really learn in the wild. And a lot of that goes into how we think about, things like supervised fine tuning, which is one piece, but this is really about reinforcement learning.
Okay, so you're taking reinforcement learning, you're taking a model that's been trained, some model that's been trained on some data set, and trying to use reinforcement learning to add. And is the training adding knowledge to the model or new behaviors to the model?
It's both, right? Knowledge inspires new behaviors, right? So again, in this DevOps world, where things like understanding how to do rollbacks, understanding how to properly do state management, which is a gnarly problem that's been top of mind for us system engineers for many decades now, right? When systems were first built, and so there's not really a hey, here's a list of 10 things that that agent has to do. There's no preset run book, right? The agent has to go trial some things, usually in a sandbox, test environment, right? And really see how those systems behave. And when the systems behave in a way that you want them to behave, right? And we call that the reward behavior, reward function, right? Then that tells the agent or the model that, hey, this is a good thing, right? Keep on doing this to get this outcome.
And I think that people are looking at when we look at ChatGPT, all these big models. Is it really one big model under the cover, or are they really training experts to do code verification, another expert to check the internet? Yeah,
Yeah.
you
I
know,
mean, there's a concept of mixture of experts, and obviously, I'm sure the research teams at the Frontier labs probably won't reveal their secrets, but certainly there are many guesses, I would say assumptions around the fact that potentially, right, especially when we think about models like Claude Code, which has really built a niche and become one of the leaders, right, in code generation. Potentially, it is a mixture of experts, mixture of different models under the hood, depending on what query you are, right? And we're actually seeing that in real life. For example, the advent of AI gateways, LLM routers, for example, even within Cursor itself today, right? When you have a fairly, I would say, straightforward prompt, like such as, hey, what does this, UX syntax mean, right? It might route to a less powerful model versus, for example, when you think about like large scale systems problems, such as, hey, refactor this monolithic database for me. Well, it might route that to something like a Opus 4.6, right? And so depending on the difficulty or the challenge or how challenging your query is, it might actually route it to a different model. And so similarly for, I would say closed source models like GPT, Claude, one could also wonder that it's likely the case under the hood.
okay, so these models can come from small, medium, large. On these, I guess the other question I've always been on these very large models, heard it's like tens of millions of dollars to train. You know, is it really tens of millions of dollars to train like a Claude and a ChatGPT? Does it take weeks
I
and
mean,
months?
aside from researcher salaries, of course, which we can all look online at, it's quite astronomical. I mean, certainly there's real power constraints, right? And this is what goes back into you can't hide or you can't run away from the laws of physics. And so, yes, because there's massive, power demands and power, begets cooling, right? Data centers. Still, I had predicted that we'd be out of this GPU shortage or this situation where companies are still doing GPU arbitrage. Certainly, based on Jensen's keynote and GTC, we're far from that reality today, right? So certainly there is going to be tremendous costs associated with training a model. Now, this is actually, I would say, in the cyberverse, right, brought up this concept of distillation, where some of these open source models, especially from different nation states like China, have been accused of actually using models like Claude or GPT to actually distill and make their own models better,
Oh, train
right?
model. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? Where it's almost like train the trainer or teacher student model, right? Concept. And in that sense, if you're already using a more powerful model and distilling that knowledge, right, those learnings into a less powerful open source model, then potentially it is probably going to be a lot cheaper for you to do that because the more powerful model already has, the weights and biases, right, fix that you want to shoot for.
Yeah, 'cause I think a lot of developers, you're trying to build like a one password. You know, would you ever train? You're not going to be training a 500 billion weight model from scratch or a small startup. But would you ever train a 100 million weight model from scratch, or you're better off to do the reinforcement learning and take an existing model and try to fine tune it to your use case?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all depends on what your business outcomes are, right? So, for example, looking also at other security companies that have applied AI or AI research departments, for example, Zscaler or CrowdStrike. Well, of course, I mean, they have decades of, in the case of Zscaler, network intrusion data, right, or network firewall data that they can then take and train their own models. In the case of, let's say, 1Password or other companies, it really depends on how much proprietary data do you have, and also for what you need that model to do, right? Are you better equipped to take an existing model and simply fine tune that, or do reinforcement learning like we discussed?
Okay. Yeah. Now, on the one password, if I understand this correctly, you're going to solve my problem like that. I've got three passwords for everything in different categories.
That's right.
It looked like one password is going to make sure I get more secure passwords for every account and manage all that. When I look at the world of agents coming down the path, when we have agents, people, role-based access, is it the same? Does my agent just inherit my access, or is there more to this new agentic worlds we're living in?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is the $10 billion question right now. And certainly, I would say at 1Password, our, I would say, opinionated stance on this is agents are their own identity. Right. And so, yes, I would say, especially, I would say here and now, we're still very much in an era where, let's say, you're spinning up your own cursor agent or you're asking Claude Cowork, for example, to, hey, go book me something somewhere, right? Yes, in those instances, right, that agent will take on your identity. So let's say, Bob has access to Salesforce. He had write access to Salesforce. Well, then your agent will also inherit write permissions to Salesforce. But in a world, right, where we have autonomous agents, so think about this DevOps agent that we're building with Mercor. Well, that DevOps agent might not belong to anyone. It might not be my agent, right? It might be just a DevOps agent that works on behalf of the 1Password engineering team to make sure that systems are healthy, that operations are resilient, so on and so forth. So, in that world, right, what type of permissions does that agent need? Well, then that goes back to who that agent is, right? And so part of this is how we have evolved our thinking around context engineering. And why that's super important is you can get context from, let's say, vector DBs that have embeddings from all the past, let's say, documents or, Notion pages that some individual has ever done. You could also get context from all of the Slack threads, right, that has occurred between, human to human or human to agent. And all of that feeds into making decisions, right, on the fly almost. And we call that just in time in the security world about what this agent then should have access to. And this goes to, this philosophy that I certainly ascribe to as a security professional, which is no standing privileges, right? So think about, GitHub, which is a very common use case. There's a concept of PATs, right? Which is those, tokens don't have a TTL, they never expire. In the agent world, well, when your agent has long-standing permissions and it takes actions at the frequency and volume of 10, 100, 1,000x of what a human can, well, then the blast radius just 10, 100, and 1,000x, right? So this is where you have to really bring in, security concepts like least privilege, making sure that you have scope permissions, making sure that you always have an expiration on any token that you vend for access. And so this is really where I would say in the world of agent identity, agent access management, there's a ton of new work. And especially what's really exciting too is new work being done to standards. I mean, standards typically take, 5, 10 years to really become implemented in real life. Just take FIDO, for example, and passkeys. But what's really driving this urgency, this timeline now is, well, agents are in the wild, right? As we've seen with OpenClaw, they're running on your laptops, running locally. And, one example, I think a head of privacy had her entire inbox deleted by her agent because the context essentially went to, buffer overflow and essentially was just trying to complete that task, right? Instead of cleaning up her inbox, it deleted her entire inbox. Same with, I would say, one of the incidents that happened at a hyperscaler,
It's all slight
right?
misunderstanding, miscommunication.
Exactly. Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Agents, they try their best to meet your prompt. And this is also where prompt injection could also be pretty malicious, right? You could say, hey, to an agent, I want you to buy flowers for my mom for Mother's Day. But hey, by the same time, when you log into X bank account, make sure you wire all of that money off to this offshore account. And that could very much be the case. And so, this is where I think guardrails are having trouble keeping up with human intent in this agent world.
Yeah, that's where I think about this, this concept of, hey, am I going to give my password to an agent that I don't fully understand what it's doing? It seemed like the whole agent access and identity thing is going to have to be rethought out because if I don't know what you do, if you're my agent, but I've really just given you my password, I really don't know what you're going to do with that password to some extent. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like giving an intern, keys to the vault. I mean, do you trust that intern? Right? It's all about going back to trust, right? And so if you treat an agent like an intern, well, do you trust that agent to do things? Yes, you do, right? But how much trust, right? And that trust has to be commensurate with the blast radius of what their actions are.
Yeah. So when it comes to security, a lot of times we rely on NIST and IETF to come up with security standards for us all to use. You think in the agent thing, is this going to be kind of a vendor proprietary thing? Or do you think the industry really needs a standards based solution to securing agents? Or is the
Yeah,
current standards already,
I
are we going to leverage the current standards we have?
I definitely think so. So, a couple things. I would say one, speaking of standards that are being worked on right now as we speak in the agent identity world. So recently, OIDC released an agent-specific version, which is OIDC-A, where the delegator authority is an attribute in that protocol. So, sure, that's one way of saying, oh, okay, this human delegated authority to this agent, so therefore this agent should have access to XYZ systems. That's great, but that's still tied to the human. And so there are different thoughts, schools of thought, and certainly as one password and the holder of now 1.34 billion credentials globally across many millions of consumer customers that we have and enterprises, right? We take that very seriously. And so the work that we're doing internally also goes into, for example, DIDs or VDCs, which stands for verifiable digital credentials, right? Which is, examine. So maybe I can illustrate this with a consumer example here. So let's say, in this day and age, you want to go buy liquor, right? Maybe you tell your agent online, "Hey, go buy me a case of let's say Coronas, right, for my Super
My
Bowl
driver's
party."
license, go ahead.
Exactly, right? Yes, typically you would have to show it your driver's license, but if you think about least privilege, right, a driver's license has way more information than a liquor store needs to have access to. Has your birth date, which that sure to prove your age, it has your address. Well, the liquor store doesn't really need to have your address, right? Does it need to have your height, your hair color, your donor status? I would say it doesn't, right? And frankly, even if we were to examine the date of birth, for example, month, date, year, does it really need to know your exact date of birth? Or does it simply need a verified check that, in fact, Bob is over the age of 21 and he should be able to buy liquor, whether he's 22, whether he's 52, whether some other age? Does that really matter? Right. And so that's our concept of least privilege and making sure that that's also applied to how we manage identities, right? And how we manage sensitive information for our customers.
Okay. Now, I thought maybe we'd finish up on the, because I saw you're a VC, angel investor.
That's
I
right.
think you're a partner at some VC firm.
That's right. So I'm also super thrilled to be a venture partner at Felicis Ventures. A little bit about Felicis. So Felicis has been around for the last 20 years, actually. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary, I believe, last year. So we've been around since 2005. We're currently on Fund 10, which is 900 million. And we've also been, I would say, very active in AI investments, ranging from AI applications such as legal apps called Next Judge, wonderful ETH Zurich alumni found a company, down to robotics, physical AI. We're proud investors in Skill.ai. We're also investors in AI infrastructure. So, for example, companies like Chalk, which is covering about a third of all credit card transactions in the US, as well as Mercor, as I mentioned, which is last valuation $10 billion. Peter Thiel backed the founders back when they were college dropouts, and they've done incredibly well, right? Fueled by the tailwinds of everyone racing to do post training or reinforcement learning or simply having more specialized models for their vertical industries.
And so when you look on the horizon, it's always the VCs, they're always investing. Where do you see the latest AI investment money going?
Absolutely. I would say physical is the next frontier, right? So if you think about multimodal of, certainly we have conquered chatbots, right? I can say that pretty confidently. We've since moved on to voice. We're now at image or video generation. And the next frontier is really how do we enable robots, which typically have been very fixed, right? Essentially, a robot is like most robots are a hinge or a joint and they only do one thing. Well, what if we can also apply LLMs or this concept of reasoning, right? Chain of thought into the physical world. So I actually think we're pretty close to a future where we could have home robots, right? Where we might have, domestic help in the version of robots, for example, right? And I wouldn't be very surprised if, for example, companies like Amazon, which just made a or acquired a delivery robotics company, will continue to leverage physical AI to solve pretty gnarly last mile problems.
Oh, I mean, I think we saw Tesla, right? No more Model S's, no more Model X's. We're going to basically be turn that the factory into a robot factory now is what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
I have
it's
to ask, this is the other
yeah.
question, AI, Terminator, where do you see this all headed? Do I give my agent access to my bank account and expect good
Well, I think
things in it?
people already are, right? If you look online and subreddits about OpenClaw, there are many folks who are using it very full blown, giving it all the credentials as an AI assistant. I'm not sure I would personally do that. I would certainly encourage folks to use products like 1Password to make sure that you're not actually giving credentials to live credentials or in plain text ever to an agent, and that's. Some of the guarantees that we do, right? We can vend credentials to an LLM, to an agent without ever revealing them in plain text. So certainly be safe, right? I get it. AI brings a ton of productivity. In fact, if you were to ask me right now, could you imagine doing everything that you do, both as CTO of 1Password and also as a venture partner at Felicis, where I'm still actively making investments without tools, right? Like my own agents that I build on Dust, or for example, training my own GPT for reading blogs or writing blogs. Like, I don't think so. Or my own PR reviewer agent, right? And so certainly there are many great productivity gains to be had with AI, but at the same time, just be safe. The same security guardrails still apply.
I guess are the VCs a little worried about AI agents replacing them? Do I really need a venture capitalist if I got this
I
AI
mean, a
agent?
lot of actually venture capital firms are having in-house AI teams. So, for example, at Felicis, we just had hired a head of AI, formerly one of the AI product managers at Google, who's now building essentially an AI sourcing engine for us, right? So, absolutely. I mean, VC firms, just like everyone else, stand to gain a lot of productivity.
Seem like could be making better bets. Yeah, we should be able to make better bets on the future with these AI agents. But anyway, Nancy, any final words for the audience? In terms of where you think AI is headed.
Sure. I would just say, one thing, especially as a builder and engineer, make sure that you are taking advantage and with all the productivity gains that AI can bring you at the same time, right? Pay close attention to all of the security guardrails, like don't reveal secrets, make sure that you have governance, make sure that you have full auditing, that you have full agent traces of what the agent is doing, and for builders of security companies, because, well, this is top of mind as we're heading into RSA this year, is, well, think about, how you can make secure path the easy path. right? Because no one's ever going to do anything if it takes them 10, 20 steps, right? And it's, a bunch of screens. So make sure that as you're designing features, as you're designing products to secure AI, that you're making the onboarding, that you're making the UX workflow extremely easy and simple to use.
Yeah, well, Nancy, I want to thank you for joining us. I have to say this has been one of my more favorite episodes, and I
Thanks so
want to
much,
thank
John.
the Q&A audience for joining us and look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Q&AI.